The sun had barely risen over the misty green hills of Varnhelm village when the monks of St. Saren's monastery stirred from their slumber. The year was 1985, and the village, surrounded by thick woods and quiet rivers, seemed frozen in time, untouched by the speed and noise of the outside world. Life in the monastery moved with sacred rhythm, matins at dawn, silence at dusk, prayers that echoed like ancient songs through cold stone halls. Brother Elias Maro remembered that day with agonizing clarity. It was a Thursday, and the smell of old pine mixed with the faint scent of bread baking in the monastery's small kitchen. The four monks who vanished, Brother Terz, Brother Alwyn, Brother Merrick, and Brother Jonan, had gone into the woods to gather herbs. Brother Terz, Elias's older brother by blood and spirit, had smiled that morning, a rare glint of mischief in his eyes as he teased Elias over a crooked hem on his robe. "If the Lord judges me on stitches, I'm doomed," Elias had joked. They were the last words he would say to his brother for 15 years. The monks walked into the forest after breakfast, laughing, robes rustling gently in the breeze, never to return. At first, no one panicked. The four were experienced in the woods, often vanishing for hours to pray in solitude or gather flora for healing tinctures. But when dusk fell and they still hadn't returned, worry bloomed like rot in the chapel's silence. By nightfall, the entire village had been alerted. Lanterns swung from trees as villagers and clergy scoured the woods. They found only a torn rosary near the edge of an old stone chapel that had long since been abandoned. The next morning, the bishop was summoned from the city. Search teams grew in number, fanning out across Varnhelm's thick groves and tangled underbrush. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a broken twig. Not a sound. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The investigation spanned months. Police filed reports. Journalists appeared asking uncomfortable questions. Some villagers whispered of pagan spirits in the old woods. Others accused outsiders, vagrants, even demons. Brother Elias refused to leave. He pleaded with authorities to keep searching. He scoured old maps of the monastery grounds, explored disused tunnels and cellars, and prayed until his knees bled. But with each passing season, hope thinned like parchment under fire. Eventually, the bishop declared the four presumed dead. Their names were carved into the monastery's memorial wall. Life moved on, but not for Elias. Every day for 15 years, he lit a candle for his brother. Every month, he walked to the edge of those woods and sat by the ruined chapel where moss now crept over broken stone like a blanket of secrets. That chapel had always felt off. Abandoned decades earlier after a fire damaged its foundation, it had become a place for silence and shadows. It was where the rosary had been found, and where, years later, Elias would find something else. The monastery had changed since the disappearances. Fewer young men joined. Funds dwindled. Faith for some had cracked. But Elias remained, his soul tethered to the chapel ruins and the unanswered question that echoed through his bones: where are they? Then, on the 15th anniversary of their vanishing, the village council announced plans to demolish the chapel ruins to make way for a memorial garden. Elias objected. The chapel, he believed, held truths still buried. But his protests were overruled. The demolition began on a gray September morning. As the first stones fell, the smell of mold and rot rose like a warning. Elias stood behind the yellow tape, fingers clenched in prayer. Then, a worker screamed. A cavity had opened beneath the floor, an old storage cellar no one remembered. A narrow stone stairway led into darkness. Police were called. The area was sealed. And for the first time in 15 years, Elias felt his heart move, not with grief, but dread. That night, unable to sleep, Elias returned alone. Armed with only a lantern and the fury of a brother who had suffered in silence too long, he slipped past the caution tape and descended into the unknown. The stairwell was damp and tight, the air stale with age. As he stepped deeper, something shifted inside him, a sense of terrible proximity. He could feel it, like breathing near a secret. At the bottom, he found a door. Old wood. Reinforced. Locked from the outside. His hands trembled. He stared at it, then whispered his brother's name. No answer. But then, a sound. Soft. Shuffling. Faint scratching from within. Elias froze. The world went quiet. No forest sounds. No night wind. Just the echo of something or someone behind that door. And that's when he knew. They had never left. They had been here. All along. The moment Brother Elias heard the soft scraping behind that door, something inside him broke loose. Grief that had hardened into stone for 15 long years cracked wide open. His hand hovered over the rusted latch, his breath shallow. He whispered again, "Terz?" Silence. Then another faint rustling. Not words, but movement. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was inside. Elias stumbled back up the narrow stairs, heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't dare open the door alone, not yet. His mind swirled with half-formed questions and terrible images. What if he'd imagined it? What if it was a wild animal? What if it really was Terz? What condition would he be in after all these years? He told the authorities the next morning. The cellar was examined again, this time with greater urgency. Specialized teams arrived with ground-penetrating equipment. And then they found it, not one, but 4 adjacent rooms buried beneath the ruined chapel behind sealed doors. Cells. Stone walls with metal reinforcements. Faint remnants of old furniture, chains, decayed blankets. The investigation team unearthed what seemed to be a hidden prison beneath the holy site. No bodies were found yet, but Elias knew. He returned to the monastery that night in silence, the same silence that had wrapped itself around him since the day his brother vanished. The grief had never left, it had only changed form. It had grown sharp and still, like a sword embedded in ice. Elias had always felt guilty. Guilty for not going into the woods that day. Guilty for laughing at Terz's joke. Guilty for surviving. He remembered the boyish joy in Terz's eyes as they once knelt side by side at prayer. How Terz would sneak extra bread to the orphanage children. How he sang hymns with such depth that made the stone walls weep. And he remembered the ache, the way grief had become a cloak he never took off. Some nights he screamed into his pillow until his throat was raw. Other nights he wandered the woods alone, daring fate to take him too. When the others tried to comfort him, he nodded politely, but no words ever reached him. It was like living underwater, everything muffled, distant, slow. Now that cloak of grief had been set ablaze. Something had kept his brother hidden, locked away. And Elias would not rest until he knew what. The coming days brought more discoveries. The underground chambers were fitted with cruel mechanisms, locks without keys, iron hooks in the walls, small drainage holes in the stone. There were faded markings in Latin and Old Gregorian script, some prayers, others warnings. Most chilling of all was a name carved into the inside of one of the cell doors, Terz, etched in crude lines as if done with a fingernail. Elias touched the carving with trembling fingers. The letters were real. He wasn't mad. He hadn't imagined the sound. His brother had been here. Or still was. But there was no sign of the monks. Only the evidence of their torment. The authorities expanded the investigation, but Elias didn't wait. He began researching the chapel's history. Its original construction dated back to the 1700s, later renovated, then abandoned after a mysterious fire in the 1940s. Old monastic records showed that it was once used by a secretive offshoot order that practiced isolationism and extreme penance. The group had been quietly dissolved after allegations of psychological abuse surfaced. Elias dug deeper and discovered that a priest named Silas Redwood had once overseen the chapel. The name triggered a dark memory. He'd seen it years ago on a list of excommunicated clergy. Redwood had been known for his radical beliefs about purification through suffering. But he had supposedly died in 1979. So why did Elias feel like the name wasn't finished with him? The walls of the monastery grew heavier by the hour. Every hallway reminded Elias of Terz's absence. Every candle he lit seemed dimmer. At night he dreamed of footsteps behind doors, shadows whispering prayers in broken voices. He wrote to the bishop, begging for access to sealed church archives. Days passed without reply. Then one morning, he found an unmarked envelope in his cell. Inside was a single line typed on yellowing paper. He was never meant to be found. No signature. No explanation, just that. Elias stared at the words for hours. Fear mixed with fury in his chest. Someone was still trying to bury the truth. That evening, he returned to the chapel ruins alone again. The police had cordoned off the area, but Elias climbed the fence with the agility of desperation. He descended the stairs, now partially reinforced with steel beams. The cell doors remained open, crime scene tape flapping in the breeze like broken hymns. In the last cell, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A patch of dust had been disturbed, revealing a small circular stone in the floor. He pried it loose with shaking hands. Beneath it was a hollow space, a small box. Inside, a journal. The pages were torn and water-stained, but the writing was unmistakable. It was Terz's handwriting. Elias clutched the book to his chest, tears pouring silently down his face. His brother had survived long enough to tell his story. And now, finally, Elias would read the truth. The grief that had once drowned him now burned into a single word: justice. He opened the journal and began to read. The first page of the journal trembled in Brother Elias's hands. The ink had bled in some places, faded in others, but it was unmistakably Terz's handwriting, tight, disciplined, yet slipping into scrawl as the pages continued. Elias lit his lantern, crouched on the cold cellar floor, and began to read. March 16th. I don't know how many days it's been. The darkness doesn't change. There's no sun, no moon. Only the sounds, the chains, the hunger, the humming of something beneath the floor when everything else goes still. I don't know if I'm alone. Sometimes I hear Brother Alwyn. Or I think I do. I pray, but my voice feels like it floats into walls that don't answer back. If someone ever finds this, tell Elias I didn't stop believing. Elias paused, his fingers tightening. The entry was dated just 2 days after the monks had vanished. This meant Terz had begun documenting their captivity almost immediately. He turned the page. April 1st. I heard them again. Not just Alwyn. Merrick, too. His voice trembles when he recites the Psalms. We can't see each other. The walls are too thick. But sometimes the pipes carry our voices. We whisper prayers like children hiding in the dark. Elias felt a lump rising in his throat. The image of the 4 monks locked in separate stone tombs beneath their place of worship, whispering prayers through rusted pipes, clawed at his soul. He continued. April 17th. He came again. The man in the mask. Tall, thin. He speaks like he's giving a sermon, but twisted. He says we must be purified, that our suffering is a gift. I think he's mad. I think he believes God asked him to do this. I tried to speak to him, told him I forgive him. He laughed. Elias's breath caught. A man in a mask. Could it be Silas Redwood? Or someone following in his deranged footsteps? He flipped further through the journal. The entries became more erratic. Words slanted violently across the page. Doodles appeared, crosses, eyes, cracked hourglasses. June 9th. Brother Jonan stopped replying. I banged on the walls. Nothing. No echo. I think he's gone. Alwyn cried through the pipe. I don't know how much more Merrick can take. We pray for Jonan's soul. I still hear footsteps above us sometimes. Like someone pacing. Watching. Waiting. Elias closed the journal momentarily, his face slick with sweat. These were no longer just memories. These were screams from a grave, ghosts still clawing at the world above. He wanted to go to the bishop, to the authorities, to show them what he had. But some instinct told him to wait. There was danger in exposing this too soon. Someone had buried this horror and nearly succeeded. He needed to know everything before they tried again. That night, he didn't return to his quarters. He slept in the cellar, curled beside the journal, the lantern's flame shrinking as darkness reclaimed the chamber. He dreamt of Terz standing behind a barred door, whispering his name, smiling but bleeding. Elias woke with a gasp. His body ached from the cold, but his heart beat like a war drum. He had to know if any of them, were still alive. The journal's last legible entry was dated June 29th of that same year. He said there would be silence, that the Lord had decided. But I hear something new now. Not footsteps. Not voices. Breathing. Close. As if the stone itself is alive. If I die here, I want Elias to know I never stopped believing he would find me. That love is a light even the blind can see. Elias pressed the journal to his lips. That sentence, so full of faith in the face of terror, it became a sacred vow. He would not let this remain buried. He began revisiting the chapel every night, searching for more clues. He explored every inch of the cellar, tapping walls, following old ventilation pipes, crawling through narrow crevices that reeked of mildew and time. One night, while examining a collapsed corner of the cellar, he noticed an odd draft. A cold, steady breeze emerged from between 2 stones near the floor. He shifted the rocks and found a rusted grate barely large enough to crawl through. Behind it, darkness, deeper than anything he had felt. He didn't hesitate. He broke the grate open with a crowbar he had smuggled from the monastery's tool shed. With a rope tied to his waist and his lantern clenched in his teeth, Elias lowered himself into the narrow shaft. It descended almost 30 feet, twisting at odd angles until he landed on wet ground. The air was thick with rot. He could hear water dripping somewhere far ahead. He took his first step and froze. Footprints. Faint but real. Human. Not old. Recent. and near them a scrap of fabric. Monastic brown. Elias swallowed the cry in his throat. Someone had been here. Recently. He pressed on, heart thundering. The tunnel led into a cavern-like chamber lined with crude carvings, symbols of purification, burning crosses, and Latin phrases warped by heresy. A small altar stood in the center, stained with something dark. Elias knelt beside it and found a metal emblem half buried in the dirt. He wiped it clean. It was a ceremonial seal bearing the initials Sr. Silas Redwood. The nightmare had a face now. Elias pocketed the seal. As he turned to leave, something moved in the darkness behind him. A shuffle. A faint breath. He swung his lantern around. Nothing. Just shadows curling along the stone like smoke. But he felt it. Eyes. Watching. Following. Whispering things he couldn't hear but somehow understood. He bolted up the shaft, sealing it behind him, lungs burning. That night, he returned to the monastery and began planning. He would confront the bishop. Demand the truth. If Silas Redwood had built this underground prison, someone in the church must have known. And if someone still moved in those tunnels, then the evil was not yet done. Elias prayed with fury. His grief was no longer still, it was on fire. Brother Elias rose before dawn, the journal pressed tightly under his arm, his hands aching from cold and fear. The discovery of the hidden shaft beneath the chapel and the recent footprints meant only one thing: someone had been there recently and someone else had left the trail behind to be found, either as a trap or as a desperate call for help. The seal-marked Sr. lay heavy in his pocket, a cursed relic of Silas Redwood's reign of fanaticism. Elias no longer questioned whether Redwood was involved. He was certain of it. The only question now was how deep the church's silence ran. That morning, Elias requested an audience with the Bishop of Arlo Diocese, the jurisdiction under which St. Saren's monastery operated. After hours of waiting outside the bishop's cloistered chamber, he was granted 10 minutes, no more. The room was lined with velvet drapes and crucifixes polished like gold. The bishop, an aging man with sallow skin and eyes like ash, listened as Elias laid out his findings. The journal, the underground prison, the hidden shaft, the seal. The bishop's expression did not change once. When Elias was done, the bishop folded his hands and murmured, "These are disturbing claims, Brother Elias, but the church cannot act on undocumented speculation and whispers from the dead." "My brother is not a whisper," Elias cried, fists clenched. "His voice is carved into these walls. He was tortured beneath holy ground. So were 3 others. The bishop sighed and rose slowly, his robe brushing the floor like falling snow. "You will speak of this to no one. There are forces within the church that do not look kindly upon such unrest. Let the past rest, Brother Elias. Or you may not." Elias stood in shock, heart pounding. The door was opened by an assistant, and the conversation was over. On the silent walk back to the monastery, Elias was no longer just a grieving brother. He was a man at war with a silence far older than he could have imagined. That night, he returned to the ruined chapel. He sat in the center of the underground chamber, surrounded by the damp breath of stone, and whispered into the dark, "I will not let them bury you again." The next morning, he noticed something strange inside the chapel ruins. The candles placed in reverence along the stone edge had been disturbed. One was toppled. Another had been moved to the edge of the old altar. When he examined the candle's base, he saw something stuffed inside the hollow brass. It was a folded slip of paper, thin and brittle with age. On it was a single line, written in the same frantic script from Terz's journal. "He wears the face of holiness but speaks in ashes." Elias's skin crawled. Someone had planted that message in the candle box after the area was sealed. But who and how? Could Terz still be alive? Had he escaped somehow, hiding in the tunnels beneath the chapel? Or had someone else found the journal and taken up the torch of truth? He showed the message to no one. The bishop's warning still echoed in his mind. But silence was no longer an option. He needed allies. That evening, Elias approached Father Dowleen, an older monk who had served at the monastery for nearly 40 years. A quiet man known for keeping to himself, Dowleen had always seemed weary of the chapel's history. When Elias mentioned Silas Redwood, Dowleen's face turned gray. They met privately in the cloister library beneath a portrait of the Virgin Mary veiled in blue sorrow. I was there when the chapel burned, Darlene confessed in a hoarse whisper. Back in 43. It wasn't an accident as they claimed. Redwood had turned it into something else. A place of cleansing, he said. But I saw the chains. I saw the punishments. He believed suffering made the soul divine. Elias leaned forward. Did you see what was beneath it? Darlene nodded slowly. There were rooms. Prisons, really. And a tunnel system we were told never to enter. Then the fire came. I thought it ended everything. But Redwood vanished. We were told he died in exile. But I never believed it. I found his seal, Elias said, pulling it from his pocket. Darlene's eyes widened, horror blooming in his gaze. Then he never left. Or someone carried on his work. Elias clutched the seal tighter. I think my brother is still alive, Father. I heard someone down there. I saw footprints. I found new messages. Darlene looked toward the darkened corridor leading deeper into the monastery. Then he's not the only one still moving in those shadows. That night, Elias and Darlene descended once more into the ruined cellar. They searched further into the shaft, past the cavern Elias had found earlier. This time, they discovered a wooden hatch hidden beneath a pile of debris. It led to a deeper stairwell, spiraling downward into blackness. At the base, they found a locked iron door. Someone had recently oiled its hinges. A candle burned nearby, fresh, still warm. Elias and Darlene stared at each other, then slowly pushed the door open. The stench hit them first. Mold, rot, old blood. The room was lined with metal cots and thin blankets. On the far side, chained to the wall by one ankle, was a man. Thin, beard like tangled roots. Hair to his shoulders. His robe torn and dirt-caked. His eyes were closed. But when Elias whispered his name, Terz, the man's eyes opened. Slow, hollow, and then they filled with tears. Elias, he rasped, voice barely human. I knew you'd come. Elias fell to his knees. Terz was alive, battered, starved, but alive. As Darlene moved to unlock the chain, Elias gripped his brother's trembling hand. You're safe now. I've got you. You're coming home. But from somewhere in the tunnel behind them, a low click echoed in the dark. The sound of a door closing, of a presence returning. The nightmare was not over. It had just stepped back into the room. Elias barely had time to react. The door behind them slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the tunnel like a death knell. The sound froze Father Darlene in place, the chain key still in his hand. Elias stood protectively in front of Terz. Instinct overriding fear, every muscle tense. There were no footsteps, no breathing, just that awful silence, thick and watching. Terz tried to speak again, but only a whisper came out. He's still here? Elias helped him sit upright, heart pounding. We need to move, Darlene whispered urgently. Now. They had one lantern between them, its light flickering with every movement, casting shadows that twitched across the stone walls. Terz, too weak to stand, leaned against Elias as they helped him up. The chains clinked with every step. The moment they stepped back into the tunnel, Elias realized something was wrong. The air had changed. It was colder, heavier, as though something ancient and cruel had awakened and now moved through the veins of the earth. Which way? Elias asked Darlene. But Darlene didn't answer. He was staring at the walls, at the symbols. They were no longer just remnants of heretical scripture. New markings had been carved fresh, wedding still running. He's been watching us, Darlene murmured. This whole time. A low groan reverberated through the floor beneath them. It wasn't mechanical. It was something else, organic, like the belly of a great beast stirring. Elias tightened his grip on Terz and urged Darlene forward. They moved quickly but carefully, retracing their steps. But the shaft they had descended through was blocked. Stone and earth had collapsed where the tunnel had once opened to the cellar. It was no accident. Someone had sealed it. We're trapped, Darlene said, eyes wide. Elias refused to accept that. He looked around, examining the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There has to be another way. Terz coughed weakly, his voice raw. There is. The chapel vault. Below the altar. Elias turned to him. What vault? Redwood. Used it for the worst. Terz's eyes closed again, his strength fading fast. Elias didn't hesitate. He and Darlene carried him back toward the deeper part of the tunnel system, searching for any sign of the vault Terz mentioned. After 20 minutes of slow progress, they found it. A heavy iron trapdoor embedded in the floor, nearly invisible beneath layers of grime and soot. Darlene brushed it clean with trembling hands. An emblem was etched into the metal, a flaming cross surrounded by thorns. That's it, Elias said. Help me open it." Together, they pried the door open. A wave of air pushed up from the darkness below, damp, rancid, and thick with secrets. A staircase descended into blackness. They carried Terz down the narrow spiral, their lantern barely illuminating the stone walls now covered in rust-colored stains and scratch marks. The vault opened into a long corridor lined with wooden doors. Behind the first, they found remains, bones, tattered robes, rusted chains still clamped to skeletal wrists. Dalleen crossed himself. "God forgive us." Elias moved on. The next chamber was filled with cages, crude metal frames no more than 5 feet high. Some still held bodies. The smell was unbearable. But it wasn't just the dead that haunted the vault. It was the feeling, the crushing sense of grief, as if centuries of pain had been soaked into the stone. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Not behind them, but above. Someone was walking over the chapel ruins. Slowly. Deliberately. "He knows we're down here," Elias said. "We're out of time." They hurried through the vault and finally found what they needed. A narrow tunnel that sloped upward toward a collapsed section of the chapel's east wing. Light filtered through small cracks, moonlight. A way out. But there was rubble blocking the exit. Elias handed Dalleen the lantern and began digging. He worked with his bare hands, pulling loose stones, dirt, and broken timber. Blood slicked his fingers, but he didn't stop. "We're almost there," he told Terz. "Just hold on." Then, a noise behind them, a dragging sound. Not footsteps this time. Something scraping across the stone. Elias turned. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. Dalleen raised the lantern, but the light flickered violently. "Who's there?" he called. No response. Just the sound. Closer now. Elias worked faster, throwing aside rubble in a frenzy. At last, the hole widened enough for one person to squeeze through. He helped Dalleen lift Terz up and push him through the narrow gap into the night air. Then Dalleen followed. Elias was about to climb up when a voice spoke from the darkness. "Leaving so soon, Brother Elias?" Elias froze. The voice was smooth, calm, familiar. He turned, and for the first time saw him, tall, robed in black, face hidden beneath a hood. In one hand, a rusted censer swung, leaking thick smoke that smelled like burned myrrh and old blood. "You're Redwood," Elias said, voice steady. "You should be dead." The figure chuckled. "I was. But death is nothing to those who walk with true faith. I was reborn in the fire. You, however, have interrupted my work." Elias backed toward the hole. "Your work is over." "No," Redwood hissed. "You cannot stop what God has ordained. Pain purifies. And your brother, he was my finest disciple." Elias felt fury surge through him. "You tortured him." "I saved him," Redwood roared, voice echoing off the stone. "I brought him to the edge of the veil. He saw truth." Elias didn't argue. He turned and scrambled through the hole just as Redwood lunged forward. A hand grazed his ankle, but Elias kicked free. The rubble shifted, collapsing behind him. Moonlight bathed his face as he rolled onto the ground outside the chapel ruins, breathing hard. Dalleen was there, helping him up. Terz lay nearby, eyes open, watching the stars with a quiet, broken awe. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Behind them, the chapel collapsed further, as if the earth itself was reclaiming the horror buried beneath. Redwood did not follow. But Elias knew this wasn't the end. The church had hidden too much. Redwood had survived too long. And the truth still burned in the shadows. They didn't return to the monastery that night. Elias, Dalleen, and the half-conscious Terz took shelter in the stone gardener's hut near the edge of the monastery grounds. It was cold, damp, and littered with years of dust, but it was quiet, and it was safe for now. Elias sat on the floor, pressing warm cloths against his brother's feet, raw from years of chains and barefoot captivity. Terz flinched at every touch, not from pain but memory. His eyes stared at corners that held no light, as if watching something Elias could not see. "He comes when I sleep," Terz whispered. His voice, like ash. "It gets in your lungs. Makes you forget." Elias exchanged a glance with Father Dalleen. They'd gotten Terz out of the vault, yes, but whatever Redwood had done to him lingered in his blood, in his bones. Terz had lost weight, muscle, years. His beard was matted and tangled, his hair like dried moss. But there was something else. Beneath the weakness, behind the trembling, was a fire. Faint, but burning. The first night passed without incident. The second, Elias crept back to the chapel ruins while Darlene kept watch over Terz. The rubble had shifted slightly. Someone had tried to dig back out from below. Elias scattered salt and holy water along the perimeter more for his own sanity than protection. He no longer knew if Redwood was a man, a demon, or something in between. What mattered was that he wasn't gone. That same day, a letter arrived at the monastery addressed to Elias. It had no return address, only a wax seal bearing a cross cracked through the center. He opened it slowly. The message was short: "They will silence you next. Do not speak to the church. Do not trust anyone in robes. Truth will bury you, just as it buried them." There was no signature. No name. Elias showed it to Darlene, who nodded grimly. He's not working alone. That became their new fear. Redwood might be the architect, but someone else had kept the cellar sealed. Someone had oiled the hinges, left fresh candles, and carved warnings on the walls. Elias remembered the bishop's words, "Let the past rest." Perhaps he hadn't meant it as a warning. Perhaps it had been a threat. Over the next week, Elias began writing everything down: copies of Terz's journal, transcripts of his own findings, maps of the tunnels and vault. He planned to hide duplicates in several places, so if anything happened to him, the truth would remain. Meanwhile, Terz began to speak more. Only in fragments at first. Sometimes in Latin, sometimes in broken, trembling phrases. But slowly he began to name things. Rooms. Devices. Schedules. He rang bells, Terz said one night, eyes unfocused. Every bell meant a different punishment. If we prayed too loud, we went hungry. If we cried, we were made to watch the others. If we defied him, the chamber. Elias knelt beside him. What was the chamber? Terz didn't answer at first. Then he closed his eyes. Where the others died. Silence fell over the hut. Darlene looked pale. You said others, did any survive? Terz nodded faintly. Alwyn. Merrick. We tried to stay strong. We made a pact: if one of us ever got out, we'd tell the world. Elias leaned in. What happened to them? Terz swallowed. Alwyn lost his voice. Redwood made him drink boiling wine. Merrick, he stopped speaking after they took his fingers. But we talked in taps. 1 for yes. 2 for no. Are they still alive? Elias asked. Terz's lips parted, and for a moment Elias thought he wouldn't respond. Then came a whisper. I don't know. I stopped hearing them last winter. Elias looked to Darlene, whose jaw had gone tight. We have to go back, he said. If there's even a chance they're alive, it's suicide. Darlene interrupted. We were lucky once. Redwood won't let it happen again. Elias stood, heart pounding. Then we can't go alone. We take it outside the church. That evening, Elias traveled to a nearby town and met with a former investigative journalist named Rian Kale. Rian had once reported on abuse within a prominent European abbey and had since been blacklisted from most religious publications. She listened carefully, took notes, and photographed every page of the journal. You're saying there's a death chamber beneath a chapel and an excommunicated priest running a secret cult in the tunnels? It sounds insane, Elias admitted. But it's real. I've seen it. I've lived it. Rian tapped the journal. This alone could blow the church wide open. If I publish it, we'll be hunted. I'm already being hunted, Elias said. You in or out? She gave a bitter smile. I've been out for a long time. Might as well go all in. Elias returned that night with renewed purpose. But the moment he stepped into the hut, he knew something was wrong. Darlene was sitting stiffly in a corner, face pale. Terz was curled under a blanket, shaking. Someone was here, Darlene whispered. While you were gone. They didn't knock. Just stood outside. Breathing. Elias crossed the room and checked the door. Hanging from the handle was a necklace, a monk's rosary stained with what looked like dried blood. One of the beads had been crushed. On it, a carved letter, M. Elias stared in horror. Merrick. He's alive, Terz said weakly. But not free. Elias turned to Darlene. We go back tomorrow. First light. We bring tools. Rope. Rian will meet us at the chapel ruins. And if Redwood's waiting? Then we stop hiding, Elias said. It's time we show him what the faithful really are. That night, Elias stood outside the hut and watched the woods. The wind whispered through the trees, and the chapel ruins loomed in the distance like a jagged mouth waiting to open again. But Elias didn't feel fear anymore. He felt something else: clarity. The walls had remembered what the church tried to forget. And now they were ready to speak. The morning came colder than expected. Fog clung to the edges of the ruined chapel like breath to glass, and the trees stood silent, as though nature itself knew what waited beneath. Elias, Darlene, and Kale stood at the edge of the crumbling foundation, packs on their backs, ropes slung across shoulders, crowbars, flashlights, and a first aid kit stuffed inside canvas bags. Elias had barely slept. Terz had murmured in his sleep all night, words in Latin, broken prayers, names of the lost. But when Elias left the hut, his brother reached out with a trembling hand, gripped his wrist, and said, "He moves the walls." It was the only warning he needed. The vault below was not just a prison, it was alive, reshaped at the whim of its master. The trio descended into the cellar beneath the chapel ruins through the shaft Elias had previously used, reinforced now with a ladder and support beams hastily installed by investigators before they were ordered away. Once underground, the air shifted instantly, thick with mildew and something sour, like spoiled incense. Elias led them through the narrow corridor past the cells, his memories now a guide. The vault, the chamber, the scratched markings on the stone. They reached the hidden iron hatch again. The altar seal had not been touched, but someone had lit a fresh candle inside the vault, still burning. "He knows we're here," Elias said. Rian raised her camera and snapped photos as they descended. She whispered, "This is worse than I imagined." The vault was exactly as Elias had left it, but quieter. The sounds of groaning pipes and the occasional shuffle had disappeared. It was too quiet, too staged, as if it waited. They found the room where Terz had been chained. It was empty now, the chain still bolted to the wall. Bloodstains remained on the cot, dried like paint. Across the far side of the room, a narrow tunnel had been exposed. A fresh one. The stone was broken recently, edges still crumbling. "That wasn't here before," Darlene said. Elias nodded. "Redwood's opening new paths." Without hesitation, they entered. The tunnel was tighter, more jagged. At times they had to crawl on their hands and knees, the floor wet and foul. After nearly 20 minutes, they emerged into a circular chamber lined with rotting wooden doors. Carvings covered every surface, symbols of purification, fire, and Latin phrases twisted into heresy. At the center, a massive iron wheel stood upright, surrounded by skeletal remains. Chains hung like curtains. Rian whispered, "What was this place?" Darlene muttered, "A chapel to suffering." Elias approached the wheel. Something was tied to its far side. A body. Alive. Barely. A man hung limp in chains, back raw with old scars. As Elias got closer, the man stirred, moaned softly. "Merrick," Elias breathed. Rian gasped. Darlene crossed himself. Elias dropped his pack and pulled bolt cutters from within. "Help me get him down." Merrick was unresponsive, lips cracked, his head jerking slightly at each sound. As Elias cut the last shackle, the man fell into his arms. Light revealed his face, sunken cheeks, blind left eye, but unmistakably Brother Merrick. He opened his mouth and a rasp escaped. "Alwyn, still below." Rian stared in horror. "There's another level?" Elias looked around. At the far end of the chamber, beyond an archway shaped like a serpent's mouth, a stairwell descended into complete black. It wasn't on any monastery map, not even on Terz. "Redwood has gone deeper," Elias whispered. They carried Merrick back into the tunnel where Rian stayed behind with him. "If I hear screaming," she said, loading a flare gun, "I'm pulling you out." Elias and Darlene exchanged a final glance and stepped into the stairwell. The descent was near vertical, winding, tighter than before. The walls wept with dampness. The deeper they went, the more warped the stone became, bent in unnatural angles as if forced into place. At the bottom, they entered a chamber unlike the others. It was round, lined with mirrors. Candles burned on every surface, and in the center sat a chair high-backed, carved from bone. No one sat in it, but the smell, sickly sweet like rotting perfume, announced that it had recently been used. A soft sound floated through the chamber. A hymn. Distorted, low, sung off-key. Elias moved toward it, following the sound into a smaller corridor where a faint light flickered. They reached a final door, old, wooden, but with one striking feature, a carved nameplate. "Brother Alwyn." Elias pushed it open slowly. Inside was a room barely 10 feet wide, 5 feet tall. A single candle burned at the far end where a figure sat against the wall, arms wrapped around his knees. His eyes were open, lips moving, singing, but his voice, it was gone. Just air passing between chords that could no longer vibrate. "Alwyn." Elias knelt beside him, touched his shoulder. The monk flinched violently but didn't resist. When he looked up, his eyes widened. Recognition. Tears. "You're safe now," Elias whispered. "We've come to bring you home." Behind them, the chamber's mirrors cracked. A sharp sound, not loud but deliberate. Darlene spun, weapon raised. The chair at the center was now occupied. Silas Redwood sat in it like a shadow made flesh. His eyes gleamed like coals, mouth curved in a priest's cruel smile. "Home," Redwood said softly. "This is home." Darlene raised his crowbar, but Redwood lifted a hand and the mirrors shattered inward, blinding light flashing from every surface. Elias shielded Alwyn. Glass tore through the air. Darlene screamed. When the light died, the chair was empty. Redwood was gone. But Darlene lay on the floor, glass embedded in his side. Blood pooled quickly. Elias dragged Alwyn out of the room. "Stay awake," he shouted. Darlene's lips moved, but no words came. Just blood. Rian appeared at the tunnel mouth, flare gun raised. "We heard, oh God, help me get him out," Elias barked. Together, they pulled Darlene and Alwyn up through the stairs, the corridors, the tunnel that had started it all. Back to the surface. To air. To night. They burst out of the shaft just as dawn broke over the trees. Darlene coughed once, then fell silent. Alwyn clung to Elias, eyes vacant, humming a broken hymn. Elias dropped to his knees, looking at the sky for the first time in hours. They had rescued Merrick and Alwyn, but Redwood still breathed, still hunted, still ruled the dark. Dawn broke over the monastery like a reluctant confession. The sky, tinged with pale orange, cast long shadows across the grass where Brother Elias knelt beside Darlene's still body. Blood had soaked through the monk's habit, the final warmth already leaving his hands. Rian stood nearby, face pale, the flare gun still in her grip. Merrick and Alwyn sat on the slope beside the ruined chapel, wrapped in blankets, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing, their lips murmuring broken syllables from a world they hadn't yet escaped. Elias touched Darlene's chest gently, whispering a prayer through clenched teeth. "May peace find you where Redwood's darkness could not." Rian lowered her weapon, voice brittle. "I don't know how we made it out, but you know this isn't over." Elias nodded slowly, wiping tears from his face with blood-stained fingers. "He'll come again. He's not done. And I don't think he ever was." That morning, Elias left Rian to tend to the survivors and returned to the gardener's hut to check on Terz. His brother was seated on the floor, staring at the wall. His breathing was steady now, his shoulders a bit straighter. "Merrick?" Terz asked without looking. "Alive," Elias replied. "And Alwyn too. But Darlene didn't make it." Terz closed his eyes. "Redwood kills slowly. But surely." Elias sat beside him. "Why didn't you tell me the tunnels shifted? That the walls moved?" Terz shook his head faintly. "Not the walls. Him. His will. He knows the stone. It listens to him. Then how do we fight him?" Terz opened his eyes and stared directly at Elias. "You don't fight the serpent in the dark. You drag it into the light." That afternoon, Elias and Rian made copies of every note, photograph, and journal page. Rian transferred data to encrypted drives. "I'm contacting my old editor in Geneva," she said. "If I go silent, she'll publish everything." Elias nodded. "But I think we need more than the press. We need a record. A witness." That night, Elias brought Terz to the vault. Not to relive the horror, but to document it. With Rian filming, he walked the halls slowly, pointing out each cell, each symbol, each chamber, and the room where Merrick had been crucified to the iron wheel. Terz whispered the names of the monks who died there. Jonan, Peter, and others whose names had been lost to time. "These walls remember everything," he said. But they never spoke, because no one ever listened. Later, Elias climbed alone to the chapel ruins. The sun was low, casting golden slivers through broken archways. There he found a man waiting, hooded, hands clasped, as if in prayer. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said, fists tightening. "You won't win this." The man raised his head. It wasn't Redwood, but someone younger, his features oddly similar. The same sharp chin, the same deep-set eyes. "You're too late," the man replied softly. "He's already been chosen again. The order lives." "Order," Elias repeated. "Redwood's cult. We are the fire of the vine," the man said. "We do what must be done. Pain is the price of purity." Elias moved toward him, but the man took a step back. "There are many of us. And your brother, he's a relic. A voice we let echo long enough to call you here." Elias froze. "You used him?" "He was supposed to die quietly. Redwood chose him because of your bond. He knew grief would lead you back. And it did. The man pulled a knife from his robe. Not to attack, but to lay it on the ground. An offering. We're not trying to stop you. We're watching. Recording. Testing. Redwood was only the beginning. Elias didn't touch the knife. You think I'm afraid of shadows? No, the man said. But soon the church will be. He turned and walked into the woods. Elias didn't follow. Instead, he knelt beside the knife, staring at the blade. On its handle were initials, S.R. Redwood's personal blade, which meant the cult had retrieved it, preserved it, still revered him. Elias stood and carried the blade back to the gardener's hut. That night, Terz stirred from sleep and said, "You saw one, didn't you? One of the others." Elias didn't respond. He simply nodded. Terz added, "There are always others." The following day, they relocated Merrick and Alwyn to a private clinic 2 towns away under false names. The church had already begun pressing questions. How had Elias been present at the site of an unauthorized excavation? Why had certain locked archives been accessed? Why had a journalist been involved? Elias answered nothing. But he began preparing a file, his final act of defiance. He titled it Testament of the Broken Chapel. Inside were transcripts, maps, survivor testimony, photographs, recordings. Everything. He made 3 copies. One to send anonymously to the press. One to hide in the monastery archives under an unrelated catalog number. And one he buried beneath the old fig tree outside the east wall, the same tree he and Terz used to climb as boys. As he sealed the container, he whispered, "If we don't return, let this speak." Rian left the next morning. Her eyes were weary, but her voice was steady. "I'll keep watching from the outside," she said. "But you're marked now, Elias. Be careful. They don't kill like men. They erase." Elias watched her go, then turned to the chapel ruins. They looked different now. Smaller. But deeper. That night, he dreamt of fire again. Of Redwood seated on his throne of mirrors, reciting hymns backward, his voice soaked in honey and ash. And behind him stood rows of hooded figures waiting. Watching. One of them wore Elias's face. He woke drenched in sweat. Terz was awake too. "They're getting louder," he whispered. "In the dark. Below." Elias got up and lit a candle. "Then we bring light to them." "How?" "We go back," Elias said. "We finish it. Just us." Elias looked at his brother, now sitting upright, more strength returning to his limbs. "Not just us. This time we take the faith with us. The real kind." That night, they packed again. Rope. Holy water. Cameras. Scripture. And the seal of Redwood, now marked with a red X carved by Terz himself. As they left the hut, a letter lay at the doorstep. No sender. No envelope. Just one line, scrawled in familiar handwriting. "If you enter again, you will not come out." Elias pocketed the note and said, "Then we burn it from the inside." The sun rose as the brothers walked toward the chapel ruins one final time. The smell of fire lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Smoke curled out of the chapel's underground shaft like whispers from the mouths of the dead. Elias crouched beside Terz, who was coughing blood into his sleeve, the wound on his side growing darker with each breath. "We have to get out," Elias whispered, wrapping an arm around his brother. "We've done what we came to do." But Terz shook his head. You still haven't seen it." "Seen what?" "The trial. Where he anointed us. The place beneath everything." Terz's voice cracked like dried wood. He called it the cross below. Elias didn't want to go deeper. They had already uncovered the vaults, exposed the cult's history, burned Redwood's altar, and freed what few survivors still clung to life. But Terz's eyes, glassy, wide, ancient now with horror, left him no choice. He helped Terz to his feet, looped his arm over his shoulder, and began the descent. Again. Rian's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie at Elias's belt. "Are you there? There's movement on the west side. I think we've been spotted." Elias pressed the button. "Hold position. Don't follow. If anything happens, upload the file." "Elias, don't." But he clicked off. He and Terz moved through the vault's scorched hallways. The walls were blackened from their firebombs. The air acrid with the scent of burnt fabric, burnt paper, burnt flesh. Still, the structure endured. The stone never truly surrendered. At the end of a corridor behind the iron-will chamber, they found the cross below. A trapdoor concealed behind a crumbling icon of the crucifixion. The image had been defaced, Christ's eyes gouged out, his hands not pierced with nails but sewn shut. The trapdoor had no handle, only a hollow to press one's palm. Elias hesitated, then placed his hand against the cold imprint. A click. The door sank inward and slid aside, revealing a staircase made of bones. Real bones. Femurs, ribs, skulls, cemented together with tar and ash. This was his throne, Terz whispered, where he broke us. The descent took them to a chamber wider than any they had seen. At its center, an enormous cruciform slab lay embedded into the floor, made of dark stone streaked with red veins. Around it, pews faced inward like an inverted cathedral. Chains hung from the ceiling. Each link bore an inscription, names. Hundreds of them, some familiar, others forgotten. These are the ones who didn't survive, Elias said, running his fingers over the metal. He recorded them. He believed their names, preserved their purity, Terz replied, to remember their pain, as scripture. They moved cautiously toward the slab. The air grew colder. Time seemed to bend. The candle Elias held flickered unnaturally. On the altar sat a book, open, untouched by dust or flame. The pages were bound in leather too soft to be anything but skin. On it Elias saw his own name, Brother Elias Maro, and beneath it Terz. He wrote us into his gospel, Elias said in horror. We were meant to be the final verses. Footsteps echoed from the far end. Elias turned. Redwood. Alive. Whole. Standing tall in his black robes, a crown of nails around his head like a mockery of thorns. He did not seem burned. He did not seem aged. He looked like the day he disappeared in 1985. You returned, Redwood said, smiling. As I knew you would. You always had the heart of a believer. You're no shepherd, Elias said, stepping between Redwood and Terz. You're a butcher who wears robes. Redwood's smile never faded. And yet I have purified more souls than any living man. I brought them to the edge. I made them holy. Even your brother thanked me once. Terz growled through his pain. You broke us. I revealed you, Redwood said, his voice rising, echoing through the cross below. Do you know why you've survived, Terz? Because suffering is the flame that burns away lies. I gave you truth. Elias raised the seal, Redwood's original insignia, now defaced with a red cross. Your time is over. The world knows. Your silence is broken. There's nothing left here but ash. Redwood stepped forward. You think this ends with me? He opened his arms. This cathedral runs deeper than blood. The fire of the vine burns in every holy house that dares not question. You'll never root us out. You'll die nameless. Unbelieved. Elias heard something behind him. Rian's voice. Distant. Echoing. Now, Elias. Do it now? Elias dropped the seal onto the altar, then lit the remaining fuse. The small satchel of explosives hummed as it activated, the timer beginning its countdown. This is your gospel now, Elias said, grabbing Terz. Redwood roared and lunged, but the ceiling began to collapse. A thunderous crack split the chamber as stone and fire erupted from beneath the altar. Elias dragged Terz toward the stairwell as flames swallowed the slab. Redwood screamed, not in fear, but rage, as though losing a kingdom. They emerged through the vault just as the second blast went off, hurling them to the floor. The chapel above caved inward. Dust swallowed the trees. The earth roared. And then silence. Rian appeared moments later, covered in ash, coughing, her camera still intact. Tell me you got it, Elias wheezed. Rian lifted the camera. Every second. Sirens echoed in the distance. Emergency responders, drawn by the blast, already swarming toward the smoke. Elias lay back, arm over his face, chest rising slowly. Terz leaned beside him, weak but smiling through his tears. You did it. We did, Elias corrected. We lit the fire, and the walls finally screamed. Later, Elias stood before a crowd of reporters outside the monastery gates. Rian had released the footage. Survivors from other orders had come forward. The Vatican issued a statement. An investigation had been launched. But Elias didn't care for politics or apologies. He cared only for the truth, and that now it lived beyond him. Merrick and Alwyn were safe, receiving care in a trauma facility. Terz was resting, stronger each day. As for Elias, he would stay. Not as a monk. Not as a brother. But as a witness. A guardian of what the church dared to forget. That night, he returned once more to the fig tree and dug up the final copy of his file. He opened it, placed the charred seal of Redwood inside, and wrote one final line beneath his name. Let no man bury what the walls remember. He resealed the box. And buried it again. The rain fell hard on the stone path leading to the outer monastery garden, soaking through Brother Elias's robe, plastering hair to his forehead. He stood in silence near the tree where he had buried the last copy of the file, the final safeguard of truth. Behind him, the bells of the new chapel tolled, calling the faithful for evening prayer. But Elias didn't turn. He had not entered the chapel since the blast. He didn't pray the same way anymore. Not after what he'd seen beneath the earth. Not after Redwood. Not after hearing his brother cry out in the dark night after night. Terz now slept in the old infirmary wing, surrounded by soft light and silence, tended to by sisters who didn't ask questions. His recovery was slow but steady. He was speaking in full sentences again, and sometimes even laughing. But the scars on his body were nothing compared to those buried deep. Merrick and Alwyn had moved to a distant abbey in Italy, far from the eyes of the church. Rian had helped arrange their relocation and continued to work behind the scenes, preparing her book. Every major outlet had covered the story now. The footage. The remains. The documents that could not be denied. Yet, still, the church tried. Isolated incident. Unrecognized sect. A deeply disturbed former priest. Elias smiled bitterly at their statements. No apologies. Only distance. He had expected nothing more. But still, small cracks had appeared in the monolith. Young monks reached out. Survivors from other regions. Families with missing sons. Questions began to rise like smoke. The fire of the vine, once buried in secret tunnels, was now a name whispered in corridors from Rome to Buenos Aires. That afternoon, a car arrived at the monastery. A black vehicle with tinted windows. From it stepped Cardinal Adrian Voss, a powerful figure known for his silence and his loyalty to tradition. Elias watched him from the garden, eyes narrowed. Voss didn't greet anyone. He walked straight to the abbot's office. Within minutes, the bells ceased. And the chapel emptied. So it begins, Rian whispered beside Elias. She had arrived the day before, disguised as a researcher. They're cleaning house. Not just of people, but of truth. They'll try, Elias said. But they're too late. That night, Elias was summoned. Alone. He stepped into the abbot's office, where Cardinal Voss sat behind the desk, fingers interlocked, eyes sharp and dry like the old scrolls lining the shelves. Brother Elias, Voss said. Or should I say, Elias Maro. You've removed your vows? Elias stood tall. My vow to truth remains intact. You've caused a great stir. A great inconvenience. What I revealed was real. And what you endangered was faith itself. Elias approached slowly. If faith breaks when truth is spoken, then it was never faith to begin with. Voss smiled faintly. You think you've won something. But you've only shifted the shadow. The fire of the vine is not one man. It is hunger. Discipline. Legacy. It's dead, Elias replied. We buried it. You buried a chapter. But there are volumes you'll never see. We'll find them, Elias said. We're not alone anymore. Voss stood. Then I offer you a choice. Return to silence. Or be excommunicated. You'll be disavowed, your writings condemned. Your brother will lose sanctuary. The others will be declared unstable. Is that what you want? Elias stared into the man's hollow eyes. I want justice. And if that means exile, so be it. I'd rather stand in the wilderness than kneel in your cathedral of lies. Voss didn't flinch. Then God have mercy on you. He already has, Elias said. He turned and left without bowing. The next morning, he was stripped of his robes. A letter of dismissal was posted in the monastery hall. But the brothers said nothing. They only watched him leave. Some nodded. Some looked away. Some wept. Terz met him at the gate, a wool coat over his frame, rosary in hand. You ready? Elias asked. Terz smiled weakly. As long as you're walking with me. They left together. On foot. No destination, just purpose. That same day, Rian published the first chapter of her book online. Under the chapel, the fire they called faith. It went viral within hours. Interviews followed. Translations. Then threats. But no one could erase what had already spread. The truth had multiplied. In Italy, Merrick began speaking again, his voice rasping through months of silence. Alwyn, guided by therapists, started painting his memories, haunting images of the vault, of Redwood's mask, of burning candles reflected in blood. The Vatican responded with a new committee promising investigation. Transparency. But Elias had already seen the machine. It would move slowly, cautiously, like a wounded serpent waiting to strike again. Weeks passed. Elias and Terz stayed in a small village on the outskirts of Florence. There, they worked quietly, helping the sick, teaching children, planting herbs behind the church. At night, Elias wrote, not just records but reflections. Not just confessions but hopes. One letter stood out. A teenager from Argentina who had found the book. His older brother had vanished from a monastery in 1994. The boy believed he had found a trace in Elias's writings. Elias responded personally, encouraged him, sent him copies of the sealed files. The flame of resistance had become a torch. One night, as Elias and Terz walked through the olive trees near their cottage, the air shifted. Terz stopped. "He's not gone, you know. Redwood. Not just him. What he carried. What he left behind." Elias nodded. "I know. Then why aren't you afraid?" Elias looked at the stars. "Because truth has a longer memory than fear." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, alive, like a prayer not spoken but felt. That night, Elias placed a new manuscript into a leather case. On its cover were just 3 words: "The Ash Testimony." Below it, he wrote, Volume 1. He sealed the case and placed it next to the buried file beneath the fig tree. Then he dug another hole, right beside it, for Volume 2. Spring arrived quietly in the hills of Tuscany. The olive trees bloomed pale silver, and the earth, once scorched by Elias's memories, now cradled new roots. He awoke every morning to the rustle of leaves and the scent of rosemary in the courtyard. Birds nested above the cottage windows. Peace had taken root, but it was a peace earned, not given. Terz was recovering. His body, once starved and battered, had regained strength. He still bore the limp, the ghost of shackles that had chewed into his ankles for 15 years, but his voice, his faith, had returned with a solemn, unshakable clarity. Together, they had carved a new life. Not in hiding, but in quiet resistance. Every letter Elias received now came from strangers, some in monasteries, others in homes where truth had long been exiled. Each envelope carried stories, missing brothers, forbidden archives, night terrors that echoed Redwood's legacy. The fire of the vine had not been snuffed out completely, it had only changed form. One morning, a package arrived. No return address. Just a wax seal bearing a cracked cross. Inside was a flash drive. No note. No explanation. Just 2 folders, one labeled Valiste, the other Phase 2. Rian arrived the next day. She had followed the data trail, traced the IP that uploaded the files. It had originated from within Vatican City. "It's someone inside," she said, spreading printed pages across Elias's desk. "A defector. Or a double agent. Either way, they want us to see this." The files were disturbing. Valiste was a hidden training facility, not for monks, but for handlers. The documents referenced behavioral isolation, constructive trauma, and submission immersion. It wasn't just Redwood. He was the symptom. The method had been replicated, even studied. Phase 2 detailed expansion plans. A new order. Smaller, mobile, silent. Cloaked not in monasteries, but in orphanages. Detention centers. Places no one thought to question. "They're rebuilding," Rian said. "Smarter. Slower." Elias stared at the screen. And worse. That night, he sat under the fig tree and reread the names carved into the old seal: Merrick, Alwyn, Terz, Darlene, Jonan, Peter. He closed his eyes and whispered each name like a rosary. Then he added more. Names from the letters. Names from the files. Names the church refused to speak. "You were not forgotten," he said. "You will not be." Over the next month, Elias, Rian, and Terz established a network, a digital sanctuary for victims, whistleblowers, and researchers. They called it the Ash Communion. Password protected. Encrypted. Hidden in plain sight. Every file uploaded was verified, archived, then quietly disseminated to sympathetic journalists, scholars, even rogue clergy. Some were caught. Silenced. Others vanished. But some began to speak publicly. A bishop in Poland resigned, citing irreconcilable truths. A monk in Brazil published secret ledgers. A nun in Kenya revealed mass grave sites on seminary grounds. The ripples turned to waves, then to fire. On the first anniversary of the chapel's collapse, Elias received a video message. Blurry. Shot at night. A cloaked figure, face hidden, whispered, "He lives." Behind the figure stood a man, his frame unmistakable. Tall, thin, with the posture of ritual. He raised his head. Though the video was grainy, Elias felt a familiar sickness creep into his lungs. The man smiled. Not Redwood, but the same smile. The same eyes. A successor. The fire of the vine had crowned a new serpent. Elias showed Terz, who nodded slowly. He never wanted a legacy. He built one. "Then we burn it again," Elias replied. The weeks that followed were filled with movement. They relocated once more, this time to France, near the ruins of an abandoned abbey known to have housed experimental liturgies in the 1970s. There, beneath cracked stained glass and collapsing arches, they unearthed old ledgers. Names. Rituals. Transfers. Proof. It was no longer a question of if the network existed, it was a question of how deep. Rian worked around the clock, sometimes sleeping beside her laptop. Terz helped translate old Latin scrolls. Elias began assembling Volume 3. But each night, he returned to the fig tree. Even in another land, he carried a piece of it with him, its soil, a seedling now growing beside their cottage. This tree is our witness, he once told Rian. When we're gone, it will remain. Then came the attack. One night, masked men entered the clinic where Alwyn was recovering. They took nothing, said nothing, but left a message carved into the wall, only ashes remain. Alwyn survived, but barely. Merrick was moved under protection. Rian received death threats. The church denied everything. But a small Swiss journal published the entire fire of the Vine dossier anyway. Leaks followed. Then confessions. Then resignations. One by one, those who had hidden in holy shadows were dragged into the light. Elias, now gray at the temples, stood before a crowd in Geneva. Survivors sat in front rows. Behind them, cameras, journalists, bishops. He didn't speak from anger or sorrow, but from a place deeper. There is no faith in silence, he said. There is only complicity. What happened beneath the chapel was not a failure of man alone, but of a system that measured holiness by obedience. We are not here to burn churches. We are here to clean them. The room erupted in applause. But Elias only closed his notes. Later that night, he sat under the young fig tree, pen in hand. The wind was soft. The air warm. He began writing Volume 4. Its first line read, "There are flames that purify, and others that consume. We carry both." Behind him, Terz approached with 2 mugs of tea. "You think they'll stop?" "No," Elias replied. "But we'll never stop either." Terz nodded. "Then let the walls keep speaking." Together, they sat beneath the tree. 2 survivors. 2 brothers. And all around them, the world changed slowly, painfully, beautifully. And though the fire still flickered in dark corners, one truth now blazed brighter: they had been heard.